If you're working a lot with data, it's useful to have your own dashboard environment where you easily view and filter the data. In this 3-part mini-series, I'm going to show you how to set this up using Dash and Plotly. In this first part, I'm going to show you how to create a basic user interface in which we can handle button clicks and display some data. In the second part, I'll cover integrating this with Panda's data frames. And in the last part, I'll take the application to a whole new level by showing you what happens if you spend some time improving the software design. This video is not sponsored by Plotly, by the way. I did collaborate with Mark Todisco, who came up with the idea to do a mini-series on this topic. So thanks so much, Mark, for your help. We spent a lot of time on perfecting the example code, so I hope you enjoy it. The code is going to be on GitHub, as always. The link is in the description. When you set up an app like this from scratch, there are lots of things to think about. Where's the data stored? How's this going to interact with other systems, etc. I've written a free guide to help you get started. You can get it at ArjanCodes/design guide. It describes the 7 steps I take whenever I design a new piece of software to help you improve the software design decisions you take. So Arjan.codes/design guide, the link is also in the video description. Now, let's dive into Dash. I'm going to start with a really simple setup today. It's just the main file that contains a main function that does nothing. And I have a couple of other files here in this project just to get me started. So one of these files is a CSS file that contains some style information for various types of HTML elements. Doesn't really matter that much what they do. These are not that complicated. It's just adding some padding and margin here and there and a few borders. Then I have a folder that contains some data. In this case, that's a single CSV file containing a bunch of transactions by date, amount, and category. I'm not going to use this data yet in this part of the video, but in the second part, I'm going to show you how to load this data and incorporate it nicely into the application. Then I have some files related to the environment. So there's a conda file, there's a readme file on how to get set up, a requirements file to install the dependencies that I'm going to rely on. And there's a couple of things here. Mostly there's Dash and Dash Bootstrap, which is going to help me define the style of the Dash application. There's pandas and Plotly, and a couple of other things that I'll cover in the next parts of this series. Then I have a source folder that contains the main file. There's also a components folder where I'm going to put in my GUI Dash components, my custom components. It's empty for the moment. I have a pylint file just to fix a few issues with pylint warnings. And then, well, the main file and a readme file. So how do we get started with Dash? Every user interface library is going to be slightly different, whether that's Qt, WX widgets, Dash. There's lots of others that are available. Dash is particularly useful for dashboard kinds of interfaces like the one that I'm going to show you today. The main thing is that Dash is an HTML framework. So it shows an application in your browser and then you can deploy it to the cloud and you can access it then via your own domain. So Dash has a whole library that allows you to create all kinds of HTML elements like divs and headers and so on and so on. So I'll just show you a couple of examples now. So in order to get started, so I have my main function here. I'm going to import Dash. And the Dash class, that's the main class that we're going to create the instance of, that's going to allow us to do everything that we need. So importing Dash, and then the first step in main is to create an app. So there we go, that's really simple. Let me delete this line because we don't need that anymore. So we've created the app. So that's one thing that's really important, which is that we have to define a layout of some sort. So let's start with that. Let's say app.layout. And now we can define what the layout is going to be. So what we can do, for example, is simply create a div and let that be the main layout. So I'm going to import HTML, which contains all the HTML elements. And then I'm going to create an HTML.div. And I'm not going to provide any extra information for the moment. And now let's also set a title. For example, I'll show that later. I'm going to use some example data showing medals. So I'm going to call this a medal dashboard, like so. So I've created my app. I've given it a title. I've set a very simple placeholder layout. And now we can start running the app. There we go. Now let's run the script to see what happens. So let me make the code editor a bit wider so we can see everything. So as you can see in the terminal, I'm now running a server. By the way, if you want to have this terminal in a tab, this is actually really easy to do in VS Code. So you just take this thing, and you drag it right up here, and now it's a separate tag. So the server is running, and it's running on localhost at port 8050. And this is what it looks like when I open that page. So obviously nothing is going to happen because we didn't put anything into the app. So let's make this a little bit more interesting. So what I'm first going to do is create a file in components called layout, where I'm going to create the actual layout of the application. So inside components, we have a layout.py, and in layout.py, I'm going to import dash and HTML because we're going to need that to create a layout. And then I'm going to have a function create layout. And that's going to get the dash app so we can get information from the app, like what the title is, etc., etc. And let's say this is going to return a div, just like before, but we're going to fill this div with more information now. So I'm going to return an HTML.div, and now we're going to fill in some of the details. So for example, I can give it a class name, which is going to apply a CSS style to the div. In this case, I'm using app.div. This just adds some padding. And then I can define children. So a div structure can contain other divs, which in turn can contain other elements, etc., etc. So this is a list. And what's going to be in the list? Well, let's say we're going to put a header 1 of app.title. So that's going to display the title of the app on the screen. And let's add a couple of other elements as well. So there we go. This is a simple create layout function. And now when I go back into main, I can use that function to create the app layout. So this is going to be create layout like so. And I'm going to import that from the layout components. There we go. And I need to pass it the app. So then this is what you get. Let's restart the server. And here you see the results. So we have title and we have divider. Dash also has themes that allow you to apply directly a certain theme, like for example, Bootstrap onto your entire application. So let's do that to make things look a bit nicer than just having the ugly Times New Roman font and everything. So I'm going to import from dash Bootstrap components the Bootstrap theme. And this should be themes. There we go. And now what I can do when I create the app here is to define an external style sheet, and which is going to be Bootstrap. This needs to be a list, but I'm only providing Bootstrap. And now let's restart the server again. And when I go to my example, you see that the style looks now much cleaner. So in layout, as you can see, I created a div. It contains children. You can create a whole hierarchy of components this way to construct your entire application in HTML. So that's really nice. So in this first part, I also want to show you a couple of things you can do with these HTML components and how they interact with each other. So to start with this, I'm going to create a dropdown component. So inside my components folder, I'm going to create a new file called dropdown. Or actually, since it's going to be a dropdown containing a couple of different nations, I'm going to call this nation dropdown, like so. So for this, I'm also going to need a couple of imports. So from dash import dash, and we're going to need HTML, of course, because we're creating HTML components. And I'm also going to import DCC, which is a collection of user interface components supplied by Dash. And now what I'm going to do is define a function called render. And that's going to get the app as an argument. And this will return an HTML div element. Similar to how I did it with create the layout, but now I'm calling it render because this is going to create an actual user interface element and also going to handle some updates in here. So that's the render function. And what I'm going to return is an HTML div that is going to contain children. And now here I'm going to add a couple of components. So I want to add an H6 component, that's heading 6. And this is going to be a dropdown that allows me to select nations. So nation, I'm going to call it. And then I'm going to use the dcc.dropdown component. So there's a couple of aspects of the dropdown component that are important. It's going to need the options that you can choose from in the dropdown. It's also going to need the current value of the dropdown. And there's a couple of other options, like whether you're able to select multiple things or not. So I want to be able to select multiple nations here. So I'm going to set multi to true. And for now, let's just define a variable here called all nations, which is going to be a couple of nations. So let's say South Korea, and we're going to add China and Canada. These are not completely random, by the way. These match the nations that are in the example data that I'm going to show how to use later on. So I have a couple of nations in here. So in my dropdown, I'm going to say that, well, the options is going to be all nations, but I need to provide both a label and a value. So what I'll do, let me make this full screen again, is I'm going to create a list comprehension that's going to create a label, which is going to be, let's call that nation, and it's also going to have a value, and that's going to be nation as well, for nation in all nations, like so, and it needs a comma. So this is what you get. And the initial value for this dropdown is going to be all nations, since initially we're going to have all the nations in there. And finally, we need to provide some sort of ID so we can later on refer to this dropdown when we're exchanging data. And in order to do that neatly, I'm going to create another file here inside components. Let's call that IDs, like so. And I'm going to add an ID here called nation dropdown. Simply a string, but now I can easily access it in different places. So in nation dropdown, I'm going to add the ID here, which is nation dropdown. Let's import the IDs. And I need to write IDs dot in front of the actual ID. So then this is what we get. So this is our basic dropdown. It has a header and it has a dropdown component that points to all of these nations. So how do you add this? Well, very simple. The render function now returns a div, so I can simply add that to the layout. So I go back to my layout, and then here I have the header, and I'm going to add another component. Let's put that in a div as well, html.div, and I'm going to give that a class name of dropdown container. And this is containing a few children, and the only child for the moment is going to be a, let's say, nation dropdown dot render, and I'm going to pass it the app that I got here as an argument as well. And we don't need source.component. We can simply do a relative import here, so I'm going to import it from dot. There we go. So now we have our simple layout containing a title, a divider, and a div containing one single dropdown. So this is now what I get, and I can click these things to remove them. I can remove all of them. I can add them, etc., etc. I can interact with this dropdown in this way. So at the moment, what I can do is delete these nations and then add them by clicking via the dropdown. But maybe I want to have some more flexibility and add a button to select all of the nations all at once, though, because now I can clear them all using this cross here, but I can't easily select all of them again. So let's do that. So I'm going in my nation dropdown component, and then I'm going to add a button to it. So that's going to be an html.button, also giving that a class name, which is the dropdown button, and it's going to have children, which is just text. So we're going to display text on the button. Let's say select all, like so. And I'm also going to need an ID again. So in my IDs file, I'm going to add a select all nations. Oh, I need to type correctly, nations button, like so. And now in my dropdown, I can point the ID to that value. There we go. So now I have my button. So in the interface, this is what it looks like. Of course, the button is not doing anything yet. We're going to add that now. So the way that communication happens in a Dash app is by using callbacks. And Dash has something called inputs and outputs. So callback can request inputs, for example, values from various HTML components or UI elements. And it can also produce values that are then communicated back to the things that have those IDs. So for example, what we can do here is we have the button, which has this ID, and we have the dropdown, which has this ID. So I can create a callback that captures a button click, a click on this button, and that then changes the values set in the dropdown here. And how do you set that up? Well, that's actually pretty simple. I'm going to have a callback. So for that, I'm going to need the app that I pass as an argument to this render function. So this is the callback. And in the callback, I'm going to have an output, which is going to be to the nation dropdown, and I'm going to have an input from the button. So from Dash, I need to import also the input and the output. And that's in the dependency module. So there's going to be an output, and this will refer to the nation dropdown. So we're changing things in a nation dropdown. And what are we going to change? Well, that's going to be the value. And it's also going to have an input, and it's going to take the input from select all nation buttons, and we're going to listen to the number of clicks. So if that changes, then this callback is going to be called. And now we simply have to define the actual callback function. So let's call that select all nations. And the arguments that we're going to get in this callback are the inputs. So in that case, that's the number of clicks, which is an integer. But we're not going to rely on the actual value. We just want to make sure that this callback is called when you click the button. And what this is going to return is a list of strings, since we're going to return the value of the dropdown, which is a list of strings, a list of nations. And when we select all nations, what do we return? Well, very simple, we return all the nations. And so the nice thing about Dash is that whenever you click a button or you do things, it's going to automatically call this callback for you and update the components accordingly. So the fact that we're having this output here means that if the callback returns this value, then nation dropdown is going to be updated automatically by the Dash framework. So I'm reloading the page, and let's see what happens now. So I can delete these countries from the list. I click select all, and now they're back. This already shows you the basics of setting up a Dash application. If you're enjoying this video, give it a like. It helps with promoting the video to others on YouTube as well. So going back to the layout, I want to spice things up a bit more now, and I'm going to add a bar chart that contains some data. So I'm going to add a new component here. Let's call that bar charts. And also in bar chart, I'm going to need a couple of imports from Dash. And very similar to my nation dropdown component, I can now define a render function. This gets a Dash app, and it's going to return a div, just like I did with the other component. And in order to generate a bar chart, I'm going to use the Plotly Express library, which Dash integrates really nicely with. Or let's actually just import Plotly Express as PX to shorten things. And I'm going to use some example data. It's data about metals, and that's coming from the PX Plotly Express sample datasets. So that's metals long that I'm using here, but there are other options as well. And I'm using this just for illustration. In the second part, I'm going to load actual data and show you how to use that. So have metal data here. And now what I can do is create a bar chart. So I'm going to use the bar, and what I'm going to get is the metal data, and I'm going to provide an x-axis, which is metal, and a y-axis, which is the count. And I'm going to color it by nation, because this is a list of nations. And I'm also going to provide that as the text. So that's our bar chart. And how do we incorporate this into our HTML content? Well, we're going to return an HTML div, and that's going to be a DCC graph. And this should be DCC, obviously, DCC graph, and I'm going to pass the figure. There we go. And now I also need to provide again an ID. So I'm going to switch to my list of IDs, and I'm going to create a bar chart ID. There we go. So import the IDs, and then I'm going to put IDs.barchart like so. And then I go to my layout and I'm going to add the bar chart right here. Like so. And again here, I'm just importing it relatively. Now let's reload the page. And now we're seeing a simple bar chart here with gold, silver and bronze medals. And these chart components are pretty nice because you can hover over them and they're going to show like some overlays, and there's options to download plots as PNGs or zoom in, etc., etc. So it's pretty cool that all this works just out of the box. Now to complete this example, what I would like to do is that this dropdown here containing the different nations actually interacts with this chart in some way. So I want to be able to select the nations here that I'm going to see medal data of. And for that I can use the same mechanism I used in the dropdown. So we have these callbacks, and a callback doesn't have to be contained within a single component, so components can communicate with each other using callbacks. So I go to my bar chart, so what I can do here is listen to updates from the nation dropdown and then update the bar chart accordingly, which is really nice. And I'm going to use the same approach here, so there's going to be a callback with outputs and inputs. So let's define that callback, so that's app.callback, and the output is going to be IDs.barchart, and I'm going to update the children of that div because I'm going to update the bar chart that you're going to see. Let me also import output and input. There we go. And the input is going to be IDs.nation dropdown, and we're going to get the value of the dropdown. And let's call that update bar chart. So I'm going to get the list of nations here, which is a list of strings. And I'm going to return the children of bar chart. So that's going to be a div again. There we go. And then actually this part, that's going to be part of the update function here, of the callback function. And then initially I'm just going to return a div with an ID of IDs.bar chart, so that I'm always creating the actual bar chart in the update function here in the callback. So there we go. So now this is called every time the input changes. And I can show that this is happening. So if I reload this page, so now it's going to draw the bar chart. I didn't do anything with the selection yet, right? So if I change this, it is going to redraw this bar chart. But of course, at the moment, we're not seeing anything yet because I'm not doing anything with this filter. So now to finalize this, what I should do is take this filter, this list of nations that we get from the drawdown, and filter the data based on these values. And the easiest way I found of doing this is by using the query method in Pandas, because this medal data is actually a data frame and we can do operations on the data frame. So what I can do is I'm going to call that filtered data, which is the medal data, and I'm going to query this. I'm going to filter this on that the nation is supposed to be in nations. And how do we pass this? Well, you can construct the string that you pass here from the list of nations, but actually Pandas has a shortcut for that, and that's like so. This results in Pandas looking at the scope in which the query is called, and then it gets the value from variables that are defined. So in this case, that nation, which is an argument of this function. So it's going to use that to create the filter data. And now what we're going to do is we're going to create the bar chart, not with the medal data, but we're going to create it with the filter data, like so. And now we're back in the dashboard. What happens is that I can change the values here, and it's going to update the bar chart automatically accordingly. I can select all, that also works. And that's actually nice because the select all button, it interacts with the dropdown and it simply updates this value. But because it updates this value, bar chart is also updated automatically. So it's a really neat way of communication between the different user interface elements. There's one more thing you can do. Let's say I delete all of these. So now it's simply going to display an empty bar chart, but maybe we want to display simply a message like didn't select any data. Might be a bit more informative than this. So if I go back to the bar chart, let's update that. And in this case, if we're going to look at the filter data, and we're going to look at the shape, which is the dimensionality of the data frame. And if the first column is 0, it means there are no results. Then we're simply going to return an HTML div, which is no data selected, like so. And of course, that shouldn't be a single equals, that should be a double equals, like so. And now when I'm back in the dashboard, I'm going to clear all, and then you see we get the no data selected div. So before I complete this part, a few things about how this has been set up. So the way I set this up is that each component has a render function that gets the application. I define callbacks in that render function, and then I'm returning a div. The funny thing is this is actually pretty close to how React functional components work, because you also have your callbacks inside the component, very similar to what I'm doing here. And then inside the render function, I'm going to construct the entire structure of divs and other HTML elements that are needed for the particular component. So it's very similar to how React works, which is kind of fun. There's a few things where the system uses, let's say, Python magic that I'm not that much of a fan of because it has some unfortunate consequences. And you can see some of those things here. So the Python magic that happens is that this callback is being called whenever one of the input changes. But nowhere in the code there is an explicit reference to this function, right? And you see that the IDE doesn't understand this because now Pylance says, hey, update bar chart is not accessed, so you can delete it. Which of course we don't want to do because it's a callback. And similarly, because I'm using the query method here on the metal data, this also does Python magic in that it accesses the scope and then gets the value from this nations argument. But the IDE doesn't understand that because nations is an argument to this function and it's not used anywhere. So it's also marked as grayed out, it's not accessed. So the magic that's being used here by the callback method and by the query method makes things easier, but it also confuses the IDE. And I think this is a good example of where Python is, in my opinion, going too far with the things that you're allowed to do in the language. And I would much prefer things to be a bit stricter and libraries to be a bit more careful about using this kind of magic. Because you can definitely imagine that there's an alternative to this query method that would not use this kind of thing, but you could just simply pass it the data explicitly. And then for the IDE, it would be much clearer that this is what would happen. And alternatively, instead of having this callback, you could assign this function, so that would be relying more on functional programming aspects, to the bar chart in some way. For example, you could attach it to the dropdown, and then when the dropdown changes, it's going to call that function. But then at least there is an explicit connection being made, and there is no Python magic being used. But the way that it works now is actually quite nice, so I don't think I have anything to complain about. So I hope this gave you an idea of how to set up a Dash application and have a couple of different components in there that communicate with each other. In the next part, I'm going to cover data loading and processing in more detail. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a like. Consider subscribing to my channel if you want to learn more about software design and development. Thanks for watching. Take care and see you soon.